The lights went out exactly the way she wanted them to, but the silence that followed would end up costing her everything. The sharp metallic click from the meter cabinet outside snapped through the cool morning air before my coffee maker finished its last quiet hiss. Every light in the house blinked once and disappeared. The refrigerator fell silent. The air conditioner stopped in the middle of its steady hum. Even the digital clock on my oven vanished into a black rectangle. I stood perfectly still, ceramic mug warming my hand, listening to the strange kind of silence that only arrives when an entire house suddenly loses power. Then I heard another sound. Slow applause. I looked through the front window and saw her standing on the sidewalk wearing a bright designer floral jacket that practically glowed under the Texas sunrise. Gold bracelets covered both wrists. Oversized sunglasses hid half her face, but they couldn't hide the smile stretching across it. She stood with both hands on her hips like she had personally conquered the neighborhood. Linda Hawthorne, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. 53 years old. White. Heavy set. Always dressed like every day was a luxury country club luncheon. She drove a pearl-white luxury SUV that somehow stayed cleaner than the operating room where my father once had surgery. Her perfume always reached people before she did. Expensive flowers mixed with something painfully artificial, and every conversation with her ended the same way, with a reminder that she believed HOA rules mattered more than common sense. Beside her stood two utility contractors loading equipment into their truck while she pointed toward my house with theatrical satisfaction. I opened the front door just enough to hear her voice floating across my yard. Community standards always win, she announced loudly enough for several neighbors watering their lawns to hear. Maybe next time you'll respect the rules. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with diesel exhaust drifted across the driveway as the truck rolled away. I never answered. I simply watched it disappear around the corner while the early morning breeze carried the distant sound of sprinklers clicking across perfectly trimmed lawns. Most people would have panicked. Maybe they would have started calling neighbors, searching for candles, wondering how long frozen food would last without electricity. Instead, I walked back inside and looked at the breaker panel that hadn't tripped. Then I opened the folder sitting neatly on my kitchen counter exactly where I'd left it the night before. Inside rested every violation notice Linda had mailed during the past 3 months. Unauthorized electrical equipment. Hazardous exterior modifications. Improper utility installations. Unsafe infrastructure exposure. Every accusation was completely fabricated. Every photograph attached to those notices had been carefully cropped to hide the city inspection stickers sitting only inches away. I had answered every letter with permits, inspection reports, engineering certifications, and county approvals. She ignored every single one. Because this had never been about electricity. It had been about winning. Linda loved the performance of power far more than power itself. She ruled quiet cul-de-sacs the way small-town politicians ruled campaign dinners, smiling for everyone while quietly deciding who deserved trouble next. I could almost hear her telling the story later at the next HOA meeting, laughing about how she'd forced another stubborn homeowner into compliance. What she didn't know was that she'd just crossed a line that existed far outside any HOA covenant she'd ever memorized. She thought she'd ordered the power disconnected from an ordinary homeowner who refused to surrender. She had no idea she had just authorized the shutdown of the one residence in the county protected by regulations she had never even heard of. She believed she had picked the easiest house on the street to intimidate. She couldn't have chosen a worse one. My name is Ethan Carter, and if you had driven past my house before all of this happened, you never would have guessed my life revolved around electricity. From the street, it looked like every other home in Willow Creek Estates. A single-story brick ranch, a neatly trimmed lawn, a weathered American flag hanging beside the front porch that I replaced every Memorial Day. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress anyone. That was exactly how I liked it. I spent 24 years building and protecting electrical infrastructure across Texas, working my way from a field engineer carrying tool bags through muddy substations to a senior grid reliability engineer responsible for reviewing critical distribution systems that supplied hospitals, emergency response centers, water treatment facilities, and thousands of homes. My job was never about flipping switches. It was about making sure nobody ever noticed the switches because everything simply worked. My father used to tell me that the best engineers were invisible. If people remembered your name, Something had probably gone wrong. I carried that lesson with me through every mile of transmission line I inspected and every emergency restoration project I supervised after hurricanes and ice storms. After decades of 12-hour shifts, overnight storm calls, and enough motel rooms to lose count, I finally bought this house because I wanted quiet. The backyard faced a line of old oak trees instead of another row of fences. Every morning, I could hear mockingbirds before the neighborhood lawn crews started their engines. The smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen had become my favorite alarm clock. Peace was the one luxury I had spent my entire career earning. For almost a year, Willow Creek Estates gave me exactly that. My neighbors waved when they walked their dogs. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks after school. Even the monthly HOA newsletters felt harmless at first, mostly reminders about mailbox paint colors and community yard sales. Then Linda Hawthorne won the HOA election. The change happened so gradually that most people barely noticed. A warning letter about flower beds became mandatory landscaping inspections. Suggestions became demands. Friendly reminders turned into certified notices. People stopped chatting outside because they never knew when Linda would appear with her clipboard, oversized sunglasses, and that perfectly rehearsed smile that somehow managed to sound polite and threatening at the same time. She seemed to enjoy finding problems that nobody else could see. A mailbox leaning half an inch. Holiday decorations removed one day late. A basketball hoop visible from the street. Every citation came with another lecture about preserving community standards. Most homeowners simply paid the fines because arguing with her took more time than writing a check. I was never interested in fighting. When she first questioned the electrical equipment mounted beside my garage, I politely handed her copies of every permit issued by the city. She glanced at the paperwork for less than 5 seconds before handing it back as though official documents were little more than suggestions. She insisted the equipment looked industrial and claimed several residents had complained about safety concerns. I knew that was impossible because the installation exceeded every applicable code requirement, and the nearest neighbor had actually complimented how clean the work looked. Still, I thanked her for stopping by and wished her a pleasant afternoon. She walked away disappointed that I had refused to argue. Looking back, I think that was the moment she decided I needed to become her next project. Every week, another notice appeared in my mailbox, each one stranger than the last. According to Linda, my backup transfer equipment threatened property values. My exterior conduit created visual clutter. My utility meter enclosure violated neighborhood aesthetics. Every accusation ignored the inspection stickers clearly attached by county officials. Every response I mailed included photographs, engineering reports, and signed approvals. None of it mattered because she had already convinced herself that being HOA president made her the highest authority anyone needed to recognize. She never realized that real authority is built on knowledge, responsibility, and respect for the law, not on colorful letterhead or neighborhood elections. While she was busy collecting violation forms, I was quietly keeping copies of every conversation, every notice, every photograph, and every envelope she sent. Years in the utility industry had taught me one lesson that never failed. Documentation always outlasts arrogance. Linda did not stop with letters because letters alone never satisfied people who confused authority with control. She wanted public victories. She wanted neighbors watching from behind their curtains while someone admitted she had been right all along. 2 days after her latest violation notice arrived, I came home from inspecting a substation outside San Antonio and found her standing beside the utility pedestal near the front sidewalk. Her bright pink designer blouse caught the afternoon sun like a warning beacon, and the heavy gold necklace around her neck flashed every time she turned toward another homeowner walking past. She was accompanied by 2 members of the HOA Architectural Committee, both carrying clipboards but saying very little. Linda did all the talking. She always did. The sweet smell of freshly watered flower beds mixed with the sharp scent of mulch as I walked across my driveway. She smiled before I even reached the mailbox. That smile never reached her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she called loudly enough for the Johnson family across the street to hear, "we are conducting another compliance review. Your electrical installation continues to raise serious concerns for neighborhood safety." I looked at the exact same equipment that had passed every inspection months earlier. Nothing had changed except the stack of paperwork growing inside my filing cabinet. I asked a simple question. Which code has been violated? She glanced toward her committee members before answering with complete confidence. Community standards do not require us to quote electrical codes. That sentence stayed with me because it explained everything. She had stopped pretending this was about safety. It was about obedience. I calmly unlocked the exterior weatherproof cabinet and handed her laminated copies of the city inspection approval, county permit, manufacturer certification, and the final electrical acceptance report. The papers were crisp because I had learned years ago that official documents lasted longer when protected from rain, dust, and people determined to ignore them. Linda barely looked at the first page before pushing the folder back toward me. "Those documents may satisfy the city," she said, "but this community expects a higher standard." One of the committee members shifted uncomfortably and quietly stared at the sidewalk. Even he seemed to understand how ridiculous the conversation had become. I thanked everyone for stopping by and wished them a pleasant afternoon. Linda looked disappointed again. She wanted an argument. She wanted raised voices. Instead, she received another polite conversation she could not use against me. Over the following weeks, the inspections became strangely personal. She photographed my utility meter from different angles. She measured conduit that had already been approved by licensed inspectors. She even questioned the warning labels required by federal manufacturing standards because she claimed they looked too industrial for the neighborhood. Every visit ended exactly the same way. I documented the date, the time, the people present, and everything that was said before placing another page into my growing binder. My neighbors started noticing the pattern. Mrs. Henderson from 2 houses down quietly asked whether everything was all right after seeing Linda visit my property for the 4th time in 1 month. I smiled and told her not to worry. Some problems solve themselves if you give them enough time. The truth was I had already begun seeing something that Linda could not. Every exaggerated accusation forced her to create another written record. Every unnecessary inspection produced another witness. Every official complaint that ignored valid permits built a timeline that became harder and harder to explain. Then came the certified envelope that changed everything. It arrived on a warm Thursday afternoon with bold red lettering across the front demanding immediate corrective action. According to the enclosed notice, the HOA had determined my property presented an urgent utility safety hazard and would be referring the matter to the electric provider for emergency service review if corrective measures were not completed within 72 hours. I read every sentence twice while the ceiling fan quietly turned above my kitchen table. The language sounded impressive to anyone unfamiliar with utility procedures, but I recognized something far more important. Whoever drafted that notice did not understand how electrical infrastructure actually worked. They were attempting to trigger a process they had absolutely no authority to begin. As I carefully placed the letter into my binder beside every other document Linda had sent, I remember thinking that arrogance often reaches its highest point just before it collides with reality. 72 hours passed without another word from Linda, and for a brief moment the neighborhood returned to its familiar rhythm. The mail truck rattled down the street every afternoon. Lawn mowers hummed on Saturdays. Children laughed at the community playground a few blocks away. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal, but I had spent too many years working around critical infrastructure to mistake silence for resolution. Sometimes silence simply meant someone was preparing their next move. Monday morning confirmed exactly that. I was halfway through reviewing engineering drawings at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar local number. The man on the other end introduced himself as a field supervisor for the regional electric contractor. His voice sounded professional, almost apologetic. He explained that his office had received documentation reporting an immediate electrical hazard at my address, and that a service crew had been assigned to investigate. I thanked him for letting me know and politely asked one question. Who submitted the emergency report? There was a pause long enough for me to hear papers being shuffled across his desk. Finally, he answered that the request had been forwarded through administrative channels with supporting documentation claiming repeated safety violations and an immediate threat to the surrounding community. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Someone had managed to make an ordinary neighborhood dispute sound like a legitimate public safety emergency. Less than an hour later, a white utility truck rolled slowly onto my street. Its diesel engine echoed between the houses before stopping at the curb in front of my property. 2 contractors stepped out carrying clipboards instead of tools, which immediately caught my attention. Experienced utility crews do not rush into emergency work. They verify first. One of them introduced himself, explained why they had been dispatched, and asked permission to inspect the exterior equipment. I welcomed them onto the property and handed them the same folder I had shown Linda weeks earlier. City permits, county inspections, manufacturer certifications, final approval documents. Both men carefully compared every page against the equipment installed beside my garage. One nodded quietly to the other. Everything matched perfectly. They thanked me for my cooperation and admitted the paperwork appeared complete. I honestly believed the misunderstanding had ended right there. Then another vehicle pulled into my driveway. Linda stepped out wearing another brightly colored designer outfit with oversized sunglasses and enough jewelry to sparkle in the afternoon sun. She walked toward the contractors with complete confidence, carrying a thick binder under one arm as though she were arriving to supervise a courtroom instead of a residential inspection. Without even acknowledging me, she informed the crew that the neighborhood had documented ongoing violations for months and insisted immediate corrective action was necessary. She spoke with absolute certainty, using technical words that sounded impressive but made very little sense together. I watched the younger contractor glance back and forth between my official permits and Linda's stack of HOA notices. Confusion slowly replaced confidence on his face. The supervisor remained polite, but explained that utility decisions required proper documentation. Linda responded by producing several photographs, copies of HOA citations, and a letter bearing the association's official seal declaring my equipment an imminent hazard. None of it carried legal authority, but someone unfamiliar with utility regulations could easily mistake volume for credibility. The contractor stepped aside to make several phone calls while Linda folded her arms with that same satisfied smile I had seen too many times before. I stood quietly on my own driveway, listening to the distant buzz of cicadas in the oak trees while warm Texas wind carried the smell of fresh asphalt from a nearby road project. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. Procedures that normally required careful verification suddenly seemed to be moving much faster than they should. I watched one contractor receive new instructions over the phone, his expression turning noticeably more serious before he slowly walked back toward the meter cabinet. At that exact moment, I realized this was no longer a disagreement between one homeowner and an overreaching HOA president. Someone, somewhere inside the system, had accepted a story without asking the questions that mattered most. The contractor looked genuinely uncomfortable as he lowered the clipboard and met my eyes. "Sir, I want you to understand that we are following the latest authorization we received." His voice carried the careful tone of someone who knew the situation did not feel right, but was expected to follow procedure. I nodded because I had spent my entire career asking field crews to do exactly that. They were not my problem. Bad information was. I asked if I could see the authorization they had been given. The supervisor hesitated for only a second before turning the tablet toward me. Across the screen was a summary describing repeated unresolved electrical hazards, multiple failed compliance attempts, and an immediate recommendation for temporary service disconnection pending safety review. Every sentence sounded official. Every sentence was built on claims that had already been disproven months earlier. What caught my attention most was not what the report contained. It was what it omitted. There was no reference to the city inspection, no county approval, no engineering certification. Someone had stripped away every document that contradicted the narrative. Linda stood a few feet away with her arms folded, watching the exchange like she had already won. I could almost smell her expensive perfume drifting across the driveway every time the afternoon breeze shifted. "I told everyone this would happen," she announced loudly enough for several neighbors gathering near the sidewalk to hear. "Community safety always comes first." The words sounded rehearsed, almost like she had practiced them in front of a mirror. I remained calm. Losing my temper would only help her. I quietly asked the supervisor one final question. "If I provide documentation proving every claim in that report is false, will you include it in your file?" He answered honestly, "Absolutely. But I cannot stop today's order without authorization from dispatch." I thanked him. That was all I needed to know. A few minutes later, the contractor opened the meter enclosure. The metallic click echoed across the front yard. Inside my home, the familiar hum of appliances disappeared one by one until complete silence settled over the house. The ceiling fan slowed to a stop. The refrigerator compressor faded away. Even the faint vibration from the climate control system vanished. I had heard that sound hundreds of times during scheduled maintenance over the years. Hearing it in my own home because of a fabricated report felt strangely surreal. Linda smiled with obvious satisfaction. Several neighbors quietly watched from their driveways, uncertain what to believe. From their perspective, it probably looked like the utility company had confirmed every accusation she had made. That was exactly the image she wanted. She thanked the contractors as though they worked for her before climbing into her white sport utility vehicle and slowly driving away, making sure everyone saw her leave victorious. The utility crew packed their equipment without celebration. Before the supervisor closed the truck door, he shook my hand. "I hope this gets sorted out quickly," he said. There was genuine concern in his voice. After they left, I walked back into my dark kitchen. Warm afternoon air had already begun replacing the cool air that normally filled the house. The coffee sitting in my mug had gone cold. My digital clocks displayed nothing. Outside, the neighborhood sounded exactly the same as always. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically. Birds chirped from the oak trees. Somewhere in the distance, a garage door opened and closed. Life continued as though nothing unusual had happened. I carried my binder into the dining room and spread every document across the table in chronological order. Violation notices, inspection reports, certified mail receipts, photographs, emails, witness notes, utility correspondence. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This had never been a random misunderstanding. Every step had been carefully escalated until a false story finally reached someone willing to act before verifying the facts. Linda believed she had proven that her authority could reach beyond HOA fines and landscaping rules. She had no idea that the single decision she celebrated that afternoon had created a paper trail far more dangerous to her than any electrical equipment she had ever claimed to fear. The first thing I did was not call a lawyer. It was not call the news. It was not walk across the street and argue with Linda. I made myself another cup of coffee using a small camping stove I kept in the garage for storm outages. Then I sat at my dining room table with nothing but silence around me except for the occasional chirp of birds outside the window. 24 years in the utility industry had taught me that panic creates mistakes, but documentation creates accountability. I opened my laptop, connected it to a backup battery, and signed into a secure employee portal that very few people outside the electric industry even knew existed. Within seconds, I was looking at the official work order that had shut off power to my house. The order number matched the one the field supervisor had shown me earlier, but the internal activity log told a very different story. Every revision was time-stamped. Every attachment had a digital signature. Every person who touched the file left an electronic footprint. Someone had uploaded photographs supplied by a third party. Someone had removed references to the city inspection. Someone had categorized a neighborhood complaint as an immediate infrastructure hazard. That sequence alone violated multiple internal review procedures. I quietly saved copies of every transaction before closing the portal. Then I reached for my phone and dialed a number that almost nobody outside my division ever used. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Grid Operations Integrity Office. This is Michael Dawson. I had worked with Michael for nearly 15 years. We had spent weeks sleeping inside mobile command trailers after hurricanes restored entire counties together. He recognized my voice immediately. "Ethan, you never call this line unless something is seriously wrong." I simply replied, "Someone disconnected my residence using a manipulated emergency safety report." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then his tone completely changed. "Stay where you are. Do not touch anything. Send me every document you have." I forwarded the complete file, including every permit, every inspection report, every HOA notice, every email, every photograph, and the activity log I had just downloaded. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, Michael sounded far more concerned than surprised. "Ethan, your address is flagged under infrastructure continuity monitoring." That designation had existed for years because my residence housed utility testing equipment approved for engineering reliability studies and emergency communications during severe weather events. Everything had been inspected, documented, and legally registered. The equipment was not dangerous. In fact, it helped improve system resilience by collecting performance data during major grid events. The designation did not make my house more important than anyone else's, but it did require additional verification before service could ever be interrupted. Those safeguards existed specifically to prevent exactly what had happened that morning. Michael continued speaking while I listened carefully. The mandatory secondary engineering review never happened. The required verification checklist is missing. Someone bypassed the normal escalation process. I leaned back in my chair and stared through the kitchen window at the quiet street outside. Linda believed she had convinced the utility company to punish a stubborn homeowner. She had no idea she had accidentally triggered an internal compliance investigation involving departments she had probably never heard of. Before we ended the call, Michael gave me one final instruction. Do not contact anyone from the HOA. Our compliance division will handle every communication from this point forward. I thanked him and ended the call. For the first time since my lights went out, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Outside, Linda's white sport utility vehicle rolled slowly past my house. She glanced toward my dark windows with obvious satisfaction before continuing around the corner. She never noticed that my porch security camera, running on its independent battery backup, quietly recorded her passing by one more time. She thought the story had reached its ending. In reality, everything that had happened so far was only the introduction to a much larger investigation, and this time the people reviewing the evidence understood electrical systems far better than neighborhood politics. By sunrise the next morning, the investigation was already moving faster than I expected. My phone vibrated just after 6 o'clock. It was Michael again, but this time there was no casual greeting. We have already verified your permits with the county, confirmed your inspection history, and reviewed the electronic audit trail. Ethan, this is much bigger than a paperwork mistake. I carried my coffee onto the back patio where the smell of damp grass lingered from the overnight sprinklers. The neighborhood looked peaceful. A few joggers passed along the sidewalk. Birds hopped between the oak branches behind my fence. Nothing about the quiet morning hinted that multiple departments inside the utility company were now examining every document connected to my address. Michael explained that the emergency work order had been modified 3 separate times before reaching the field crew. Each revision removed information that proved my installation had passed every required inspection. More importantly, the photographs attached to the report had not come from any company employee. They had been submitted by an outside source claiming to represent the Homeowners Association. That immediately raised another question. Who authorized an external complaint to be treated as verified engineering evidence? Before I could ask, Michael answered it himself. Nobody should have. He told me that the compliance division had frozen every action related to my property and had begun interviewing dispatch supervisors, record specialists, and everyone who had touched the file. Every login, every upload, every approval, every change left a permanent digital record. That was one of the beautiful things about modern utility systems. Electricity may travel invisibly, but accountability leaves fingerprints everywhere. Around 9 o'clock, a white sedan with the utility company's compliance logo quietly parked across the street. 2 investigators stepped out carrying tablets instead of tool bags. They did not come to my front door immediately. Instead, they spent nearly 20 minutes examining the meter enclosure, photographing every inspection label, every serial number, every permit sticker, and every safety marking. They compared everything against the digital records already stored in their system. When they finally knocked on my door, the older investigator introduced herself as Karen Mitchell from Grid Compliance Review. She thanked me for preserving every document instead of arguing with the field crew. Most people become emotional, she admitted. You built a timeline. I invited both investigators inside and spread my binder across the dining room table exactly as it had remained since the previous afternoon. Linda's violation notices sat beside county approvals. Certified mail receipts matched email timestamps. Security camera images corresponded with every inspection visit. Karen slowly turned each page while her partner quietly scanned documents into their secure system. Neither of them interrupted the other because neither needed to. The pattern spoke for itself. Weeks of unsupported accusations had gradually evolved into a fabricated emergency. Before leaving, Karen asked one unexpected question. Do your exterior cameras record audio? I nodded and opened another folder containing archived footage. One recording captured Linda telling the utility contractors that my equipment had repeatedly failed inspections. Another captured her claiming multiple government agencies had already declared my installation unsafe. Neither statement was true. Every official inspection had been passed on the first review. Karen requested copies of every recording. As the files transferred onto her encrypted drive, she smiled for the first time all morning. These videos matched the timeline perfectly. After they left, I noticed several neighbors quietly watching from their porches. Word traveled quickly through Willow Creek Estates. People who had avoided eye contact the previous afternoon were suddenly waving again. Mrs. Henderson even walked over with a fresh loaf of homemade banana bread and softly admitted she had never believed Linda's accusations in the first place. I thanked her, but I also understood something important. Truth rarely arrives as quickly as rumors. It takes patience to catch up. Later that afternoon, another vehicle stopped outside my house. This time it was not from the utility company. It belonged to the Homeowners Association. Linda stepped out wearing another expensive outfit, holding a folder against her side with the same confident posture she always carried. She marched toward my driveway expecting another easy victory. What she did not realize was that every conversation from this moment forward would become part of an investigation far beyond the authority of any homeowners association. And the story she had carefully written for months was about to be rewritten using her own words. Linda walked toward my front porch with the same confident smile she had worn the morning my power was disconnected. The afternoon sun reflected off the oversized gold buttons on her bright designer jacket, and her expensive sunglasses hid any hint of uncertainty. She held a thick HOA folder against her side like it was a winning hand of cards. "Mr. Carter," she said before I even opened the screen door, "I believe we should discuss your continued non-compliance before this situation becomes even more serious." I almost admired how calm she sounded. She honestly believed she was still in control. I stepped onto the porch and quietly closed the door behind me. "I think that would be a very short conversation," I replied. "Everything that needed to be discussed has already been submitted to the people who actually have authority over this matter." Her smile faded for less than a second before returning. "The Homeowners Association has complete documentation supporting our actions." I nodded politely. "So do I." Before she could respond, another vehicle turned onto our street. Then another. Neither carried flashing lights or dramatic markings. They were ordinary utility fleet vehicles, the kind nobody noticed until they stopped in front of a specific address. 3 people stepped out. Karen Mitchell led the group, accompanied by Michael Dawson and the same field supervisor who had reluctantly disconnected my service the previous afternoon. The supervisor walked directly toward me before saying anything else. "Mr. Carter, on behalf of the company, I want to apologize. Your service should never have been interrupted." He handed me a written restoration authorization bearing multiple executive approvals. Within minutes, another technician carefully reopened the meter enclosure. The familiar metallic sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood once again, but this time it was followed by something entirely different. Inside the house, the refrigerator hummed back to life. The air conditioning system started its steady rhythm. Digital clocks blinked 12 o'clock before resetting themselves. Cool air slowly drifted through the open doorway. It was one of the most satisfying sounds I had ever heard, not because the electricity had returned, but because the truth had finally caught up with the lie. Linda stepped forward, clearly expecting someone to explain why the utility company had suddenly changed its position. Karen Mitchell calmly introduced herself and asked Linda a simple question. "Did you submit or authorize the supporting documents attached to the emergency safety complaint for this property?" Linda answered without hesitation. "Yes, I acted to protect the neighborhood." Karen tapped her tablet a few times before looking back up. "Our investigation determined that multiple statements contained in those submissions were inconsistent with verified inspection records, county permits, and company documentation. We have preserved the complete electronic audit trail." For the first time since I had met her, Linda had no immediate response. She looked from Karen to Michael and then toward the field supervisor, searching for someone willing to support her version of events. Nobody spoke. Michael finally broke the silence. "Every revision made to the work order has been identified. Every attachment has been recovered. Every communication associated with this case has been secured for internal review." The neighborhood had quietly gathered along the sidewalks by then. Nobody interrupted. Nobody whispered. The same people who had watched my house go dark the day before were now watching experienced utility professionals explain exactly why the decision had been reversed. Karen thanked me for maintaining complete records and for cooperating throughout the investigation. She also thanked the field supervisor for immediately reporting his concerns after reviewing the evidence. Good documentation, she explained, had allowed the company to correct its own mistake quickly while strengthening procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. Linda slowly lowered the folder she had carried so confidently only minutes earlier. The papers inside suddenly looked much smaller than they had the day before. She had spent months believing that enough paperwork could create authority. Instead, real records, verified inspections, digital logs, and objective evidence had quietly dismantled every unsupported claim she had made. As the utility vehicles pulled away and the familiar sound of my air conditioner filled the house again, I realized something my father had taught me years earlier was still true. Systems built on facts eventually correct themselves. Systems built on ego eventually collapse under the weight of their own paperwork. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal over the following weeks, but it was not the same neighborhood anymore. The difference was subtle at first. People stopped lowering their voices when they talked about HOA meetings. Neighbors who had quietly accepted questionable violation notices suddenly started asking for written explanations instead of immediately writing checks. Mrs. Henderson smiled a little more when she walked her golden retriever each morning. The Johnson family finally installed the basketball hoop their children had wanted for months after confirming it actually complied with every published guideline. It was never about breaking rules. It was about finally understanding the difference between real rules and someone's personal opinions. As for me, life became wonderfully ordinary again. Every morning, the familiar aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen while the refrigerator hummed quietly in the background, and the air conditioner filled the house with cool air during another hot Texas afternoon. Those simple sounds meant more to me than they ever had before because I knew exactly how easily they could have been taken away when the wrong people believed confidence mattered more than facts. A few weeks after my service was restored, I received a formal letter from the utility company confirming that the internal review had been completed. The company acknowledged that established verification procedures had not been fully followed before the temporary disconnection order was approved, apologized for the disruption, and outlined several procedural improvements designed to reduce the risk of similar mistakes in the future. Reading that letter brought me far more satisfaction than any dramatic confrontation ever could have. Systems become stronger when they learn from their failures. That has always been the mark of real professionalism. The Homeowners Association also changed. New board elections were held later that season, and several residents who had never participated before decided it was finally time to volunteer. They wanted transparency instead of intimidation, cooperation instead of unnecessary conflict, and common sense instead of personal agendas. I wished every one of them well, because healthy communities are built by neighbors who respect one another, not by people trying to control one another. Every now and then someone still asks me whether I ever wanted revenge after everything that happened. My answer is always the same. No, revenge fades. Accountability lasts. I spent my entire career believing that good engineering depends on accurate records, careful inspections, and quiet responsibility. It turns out those same principles work just as well in everyday life. Documents outlast accusations. Facts outlast rumors. Patience outlasts arrogance. Looking back, I sometimes think about that first metallic click when my power disappeared. At the time, it sounded like defeat. Now it sounds more like the beginning of a lesson that needed to happen. Not just for Linda, not just for the utility company, for everyone who watched from their front porch and learned that authority without accountability is only temporary. The strongest switch in this entire story was never inside the meter cabinet outside my house. It was the decision to stay calm, preserve every document, respect every lawful process, and let the truth travel at its own pace. Justice is rarely loud. Most of the time it arrives quietly, one verified fact at a time, until there is simply no room left for fiction. I still sit on my back porch most evenings listening to the mockingbirds in the oak trees while the warm breeze carries the familiar scent of freshly cut grass across the yard. The neighborhood feels peaceful again, and that is all I ever wanted when I bought this house. If there is one thing I hope people remember from my story, It is that knowledge will always be stronger than intimidation, and integrity will always outlast ego. I would genuinely like to know what you think after hearing everything that happened. Do you believe I handled the situation the right way, or would you have done something differently? Share your thoughts in the comments because I enjoy reading different perspectives. And if stories like this remind you that patience, truth, and steady determination can still win, I hope you will consider subscribing so you will not miss the next journey where ordinary people stand their ground and let justice speak for itself.